So I thought I'd give you the real history of the Democratic Party, not the history from the textbooks. And there's basically three events or three individuals I wanted to focus on that led to the development of the Democratic Party as we know it. And it's an interesting collection. The first of the three is the illegitimate son of a French whore living in the Caribbean. Okay? Piqued your interest? The second event that created the Democratic Party was a controversial presidential election where the elites took the election away from the people, ignored the popular vote, and gave it to someone else. And the third individual or event that really created the Democratic Party was one of the greatest Republican presidents ever. All right, you ready? Okay, so the illegitimate son of a French whore living in the Caribbean, that would be Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton's mother, Rachel Fawcett Lavigne, or Lavigne, Alexander Hamilton's biological father, James Hamilton from Scotland, never married his mother. And Hamilton barely knew his biological father. The mother was probably a practitioner in both Nevis and St. Croix of the world's oldest occupation. And that's the one before agriculture out there. There's one occupation that predates agriculture. And Hamilton was an amazing man. His mother used to, and I'll put the word in quotes, she would service all the ships that would stop in the islands to get fresh water, supplies, drop off or pick up slaves, sugar, so forth and so on. So she taught Alexander 7 languages, but here's what she did. The money she made from her business, she collected probably the largest library in the island of Nevis. And she bought classics, Pope, Aristotle, all the way down. And she taught those to her young son. Alexander Hamilton was one of the two probably most important people in the Constitutional Convention of 1787, the other one being Thomas Jefferson. Now, Jefferson was not physically present at the convention, but Jefferson and Hamilton were the two ideas guys behind what happened in Philadelphia. In the years after we got rid of the British, we were governed by the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation proved completely ineffective. It only had one branch of government, the Congress. There was no executive. There was no mechanism to deal with foreign policy, domestic policy. Basically, under the Articles of Confederation, they were saying to the country, good luck, you're on your own, which is kind of Romney's campaign motto, I guess, this time around. Good luck, you're on your own. We couldn't deal with the debt and other issues. So the framers had gathered in Annapolis the year before, during the summer of 1786. And they tried to improve the Articles and come up with a governing system. However, several states didn't send delegates, several delegates boycotted it, and they didn't agree on a darn thing that summer. The only thing they agreed on in 1786 at Annapolis was they would try to meet again the next summer. But what they did was they figured sometimes lightning or magic strikes twice, so they'll go back to Philadelphia. And that was the hot, humid summer of 1787. Now, when the delegates met, they didn't know what they wanted to do. They knew they didn't want a mobocracy with everybody governing, but they knew they didn't want a monarchy. They thought about splitting the difference, and they didn't know what that would look like, because we went beyond what the Romans had tried, we went beyond what the Greeks had philosophized about. But at that convention, the two leading voices, one by proxy, Jefferson, he wrote it all down and sent it to everyone who would read his point, and the other one, Hamilton. Jefferson favored a decentralized government, a weak government at the local level, an inactive role for the federal government. Hamilton, on the other hand, advocated a strong executive, a role for the federal government, a blending of the states and the federal government into federalism, a national economic policy, a bank, he was the Secretary of Treasury eventually, and so forth and so on. The ideas of that illegitimate son from a French whore living in the Caribbean became the basis for today's Democratic Party. The Democratic Party today philosophically embodies what Hamilton wanted the country to look like. Thomas Jefferson, his ideals, what he advocated, embodies today the philosophical underpinnings of the Republican Party. The irony here is many. One, Democrats celebrate the Jefferson-Jackson Day, which is only partially true. If Thomas Jefferson was alive today, well, I don't know about today's Republicans, but the days of Eisenhower or Gerald Ford and normal Republicans, Thomas Jefferson would be a Republican. Not the Tea Party today, but he would be a Republican as we know them in modern times. Alexander Hamilton would absolutely be a Democrat. So his vision is what is guided philosophically in terms of the underpinnings. The structure of government, the role, scope, size, function of government comes from Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was a real visionary, an absolute visionary, extraordinary man. Okay, move to the second event. Political parties. Now, we didn't have political parties when the country was founded, mainly because of George Washington. George Washington opposed political factions. And Washington had such gravitas, such universal respect. He was so larger than life that the simple fact, and I know you can cut through all the paragraphs and pages and chapters in the books, the main reason we did not have parties in the beginning was because George didn't want them. That's the kind of gravitas he has. Maybe an FDR, maybe a George Marshall. I can't think of hardly anyone in the 20th century, a Churchill, that had that kind of stature that George had. So we didn't have parties. However, George died in mid-December of 1799. Before he got cold, political parties formed. So in the 1800 election, it was the first election with political parties. And the one party was the Federalist faction, led by John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, so you see where they were going, and within the memory of George Washington. If Washington was alive today, he'd be a Democrat, no question about it. Ditto with Adams. The other party was the anti-Federalist, led by Thomas Jefferson, which was the no government, no role for government type of party. And that 1800 election was a fascinating election. The question was, one, are we a grown-up, mature enough country now without our father, George, around to make this thing called democracy work? Number two, can we have an election with political parties? Many thought we could not, and we darn near didn't. We almost lost it in 1800. In 1800, it was Adams against Jefferson, which was a huge election. Two of the most important founders. And Jefferson had been serving as Adams' vice president. That's like Biden challenging Obama. So it was controversial. First election with political parties, first election without George Washington. Jefferson beats Adams, but something bizarre happens. Jefferson's vice presidential selection, Aaron Burr, his name was in the hopper on the ticket, and Jefferson and Burr tied, 73-73. Now, the Constitution is silent on what to do in the event of a tie. And without George Washington around, no one knew what to do. We did not have a re-vote like we did here in Palm Beach County. We had a recount. Excuse me, not a recount, we had a re-vote. Gore should have pushed for a re-vote, by the way. Had he done that, I think we'd have a different history. And not a recount, but a complete re-vote. So they re-voted, and it was a tie. Get this, they had 35 tied ballots, day after day after day. People were putting up their hands saying democracy doesn't work. You see, political parties are the death of us. You know, maybe they were visionaries too, right? Finally, on the 36th ballot, Jefferson's lifelong enemy, Alexander Hamilton, broke the tie. Probably the least likely person to do so. So Hamilton breaks the tie in 1800. And when he does it, he announces that although Jefferson is my avowed enemy, unlike Burr, at least Jefferson's sane. The rest is history. Burr, of course, 4 years later, shoots him. Burr's the sitting vice president. Of course, the joke here, that means Dick Cheney wasn't the first vice president to shoot someone. He's just the second vice president to shoot someone. So the political parties were almost the death of us. Jefferson is elected, and a couple things happen. That election basically resulted in the death of Alexander Hamilton, eventually. Secondly, the Federalists, the party that would provide the conceptual framework for what we are today as Democrats, the Federalist Party loses. And they were utterly discredited. One, Washington was dead. Hamilton has a number of unbelievable sex scandals. Imagine that for a Democrat. I know it's hard to believe. Hamilton then gets shot. Adams is a great man, but he's very thin-skinned. Adams is so angry that Jefferson challenged him and defeated him that the night before the inauguration, which back then was March 4th of 1801, the night before the inauguration, Adams loads up the carriage and sneaks out under cover of darkness, sneaks out of the capital city. Jefferson shows up for the inaugural. There's no president of the United States. So Adams discredited himself. So the Federalists are on the outs. Jefferson serves 2 terms. His hand-picked successor, Madison, serves 2 terms. His hand-picked successor, Monroe, serves 2 terms. After 6 straight terms, the Federalists were gone. We basically had one-party government. And that Jeffersonian party, the Anti-Federalists, calls themselves the Democratic Republicans, which is an awkward, confusing name. But hey, it's politics. It's supposed to be confusing. This is why the Democrats claimed Jefferson, because it was the Democratic Republican Party, although quite frankly it was today's Republican Party. Now, the second main event that shaped our party, 2 hugely controversial elections, I think 2 of the most fascinating in history, 1824 and 1828. Here's what happens. We're looking for the 6th president of the United States, 1824, and we have the biggest contrast in history. One, you have John Quincy Adams, Harvard-educated diplomat, speaks many languages, the son of a president. And many people felt that that was inappropriate in a democracy. Plus, they felt it was too soon. He was running for president only 4 terms after his father. Good thing we've never had that since then, right, everyone? So you have this elite John Quincy Adams, son of a president, the elites, to be our 6th president. And all the presidents before, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Monroe, Madison, they'd all been among the wealthiest, most powerful men in the country. And he's challenged by Andrew Jackson, whose parents, by the way, Obama could relate, parents were Irish immigrants who came here. Father died when the mother was pregnant, so Jackson never knew his father. I guess they weren't real Americans. Jackson was orphaned as a child, lied about his age and fought in the Revolution, was a great hero in the Revolution. But Jackson is a man of the people. His hobbies, cockfighting, horse racing, sleeping with prostitutes, gambling, and dueling. Great Democrat. Okay, great Democrat. So Jackson is this man of the people, moves to Kentucky and then Tennessee, the frontier, and is a self-taught attorney, man of the people. How dare he challenge John Quincy Adams? In 1824, Jackson, the duelist, wins the popular vote. However, we had very primitive transportation systems because certain people felt we shouldn't have infrastructure, kind of like today, right? Socialism to build roads and bridges and schools and high-speed internet technology. And Jackson goes back to Tennessee with primitive transportation and even more rudimentary communication systems. He's preparing to go to Washington for the inaugural. The Electoral College meets, the elites gather, and they flip the outcome of the election. Are you allowed to do that if you're an elector? Yes, you are. The framers, Article 2 of the Constitution, envision the electors as what I call, I like sports analogies, so free agents. The electors are free agents. Jackson is outraged when he arrives. He vows to destroy John Quincy Adams and challenge him again in 4 years. 1828 is the 2nd nastiest presidential election in history. This one is the worst in terms of negativity, the sheer volume and the attacks on Obama. Jackson vows to beat John Quincy. It's a horrendous election. Jackson's wife had been married to 2 men at a time, and she was called the whore of Tennessee, lady bigamist. He was called a wife thief. All these other things, which were true. Jackson's supporters refused to call John Quincy Adams his excellency or his presidency. They called him his fraudulency. And it was a controversial election. John Quincy Adams' people went after Jackson's wife as a whore. She was devoutly religious, and it just tore her up. She dies after the election, but before the inauguration. Jackson says of a broken heart because of the attacks. In fact, she's buried on Christmas Eve in the gown she was going to wear to the inaugural. So Jackson comes back in 4 years in 1828, maybe the most important election in history, and he whoops John Quincy Adams. We only had a few million people in this country, but get this, over 800,000 people more voted in 1828 than 1824. Talk about get out the vote. People liked Jackson. They related to him. Jackson comes in and a couple things happen. He is so outraged with the elites for what they did that he refuses to be a part of that party. And he establishes a brand new political party, the Democratic Party, and basically kicks it off in 1829. Forget the dates in the textbook. 1829 is when it's formalized. 1829 kicks off a brand new Democratic Party. Coonskin democracy for the common folk. The people that showed up and became postmasters and followed him were the folks that dressed like Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett. Jackson dressed like that. And that's basically the start of the Democratic Party. Now, what we would see is the third major incident, one of the great Republicans. That would be Teddy Roosevelt. 1901 to 1909 was when he was president. The great TR. Teddy Roosevelt was one of the greatest progressives in American history. He took over as police commissioner in New York City. And New York City in the late 1800s made Las Vegas look like Utah. Okay? New York City was prostitution, gambling, worse than you can imagine. Just horrendous. Teddy Roosevelt came in and put in professional policing, stopped the this crony Tammany Hall boss tweed system. He initiated what today we call community policing. Teddy Roosevelt was a great reformer and a great progressive. And he rises up. He's the head of the Republican Party in New York in his early 20s, everyone. The problem was the Republican elites found him to be a danger, a threat. So they needed to figure out what to do with him. Of course, TR goes in 1898 to Cuba with the Spanish-American War, the Rough Riders, everyone, and charges up San Juan and Kettle Hills with a sword drawn spins around as bullets whiz by him. The Spanish are dug in on the high ground, which you want to have in military parlance back then. TR is basically the first man over their line, killing the Spanish with his hands. We defeat the Spanish, and TR is a great hero. Now, what helped Teddy Roosevelt was he paid for and took along his own camera crew, who all filmed his exploits, and he paid to release it around the country. Be that as it may. Be that as it may. TR was so great and such a great reformer and progressive that he became a problem for his own Republican Party. So they needed to figure out what the heck they were going to do with this guy. So there used to be an old saying. The old saying went something like this. A woman had 2 sons, and one of them joined the Navy and sailed the 7 seas. The other one became vice president. Neither one was ever heard of again. That used to be an old saying. So they decided to make TR the vice president. That would get him out of the way. It would put him in the, John Adams called it the least significant job we ever invented. Okay? John Adams also said, if I went over my life again, I'd rather be a shoesmith than the vice president. Okay? And of course, John Nance Garner, FDR's first vice president, famously called the VP spot not worth a warm bucket of spit. Actually, he used another 4-letter word that rhymed, with spit that farmers might be very comfortable with. But the press back then had a little bit of standards, not the broadcast mediocrity of today. They wrote spit. So they made him vice president. Lo and behold, William McKinley's assassinated in 1901, and Teddy Roosevelt's the president. Teddy Roosevelt cannot be stopped by anyone. Okay? He's one of the great progressives of history. Here's what happens as a result. He scared the hell out of his own political party who wanted nothing to do with him. When in 1908, that election, TR doesn't run for re-election, the Republican Party decides it's going to take the exact opposite position of everything TR did. They became pro-big business, against the common person, against regulation, against food safety, against child labor laws that TR pushed, against conservation, against everything. Everything. They went against everything. And the Democratic Party had been locked out of the White House from Abraham Lincoln, 1861 to 65, all the way up to McKinley, only one Democratic president, Grover Cleveland. So the Democratic Party had been locked out of the White House. The Democrats were in search of a position. The Democrats, for too long in the 1800s, had been dominated by Southern slave-owning corrupt interests. So the Democrats adopt Teddy Roosevelt's policies. And in the 1908 election, the Republicans won under Taft. You have the modern party positions of today. Fortunately, Teddy Roosevelt comes back after hunting in Africa and being the first white man down the Amazon. Teddy Roosevelt comes back and is so outraged with Taft and the Republicans that he creates a third-party progressive party called the Bull Moose Party in 1912. And TR is so beloved that it's the only time in American history a third party beats one of the 2 major parties. It came in 2nd place, which allowed Woodrow Wilson to win. Wilson's the other great progressive. And from that period of 1901 through Wilson's presidency, we have the push for child labor laws, pro-union, pro-labor, regulation, things on behalf of the common person. In cities, we had the progressivism in cities. Imagine during the Industrial Revolution, late 1800s, without running water, without sewage systems, professional policing, hospitals. You know, the dominant mode of transportation was a horse and the streets were all mud. Do the math. The advent of the awning, everyone, it was because everyone had an overnight bucket where you did your business, and in the morning you threw it out on the streets, and if you were on a sidewalk, the awning protected you. In the early 1900s, Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson pushed urban programs. They built police departments, fire departments, paved roads, zoning laws, housing standards. And all that became part of the Democratic Party. I'll end with this. The 1960s were also a great period for the Democratic Party, and I think the Democrats just fine-tuned their commitment to social justice. Think of any of the great social justice movements of the 1960s. They all were championed by, shepherded by the Democrats. The modern women's movement, the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement, the consumer protection movement, the free speech movement, the modern environmental movement, all this courtesy of the Democrats, which fine-tunes it. In closing, if you go back through American history and you look at any of the great policy debates, anti-war, free speech, Social Security in 1935, Medicare in 65, a push for national health insurance or universal health care, civil rights, women's rights, the environment, every single major social justice issue of the 20th century, there was one party that was against every one of them and one party that was for every one of them. So the proud thing as a Democrat is know this, that the left has always been on the right side of history. Okay?